Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. King Herod heard of the disciples preaching, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, "John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work within him." But others said, "It is Elijah." And others said, "It is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias, well, she had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" And the mother replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately, she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was deeply grieved. Yet, out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately, the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. And he went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to his mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took John's body and laid it in a tomb. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. With today's gospel reading, we are wrapping up what has been largely a chronological study of the early part of Mark's gospel. We're not quite done with Mark yet. We're going to take a little bit of a break from Mark, and it's not my choice, it's the lectionary's choice, but we're going to take a break until about September. And next week, what we're going to do is we're going to celebrate the Feast of Mary Magdalene, and then we're going to have a 5-week series on John's Bread of Life discourse. So when I read today's reading, and I knew that we were ending our exploration of Mark for a bit, I thought it was kind of an odd passage for us to wrap up on. I mean, it isn't even really about Jesus. And if I could imagine somebody strolling into church for the first time and not quite sure what this Christianity thing is about, it might kind of turn into somebody thinking that actually it's all about John. And the reality is, it's not. But the thing about today's story is it kind of sounds a lot like Jesus' story. You see, like Jesus, John was preaching and teaching and telling the truth to those who believed that they could say, do, and treat people however they like. Like Jesus, John was arrested and put in prison. Like Jesus, John was initially protected by a powerful ruler. But, like Jesus, John was executed because of a ruler's own self-interest in keeping power and control. And then, like Jesus, John is killed to appease the wishes of others. Do you see where this is going here? Like Jesus, John's followers took his dead body, and like Jesus, they laid it in a tomb. And like Jesus, John was believed to have been raised from the dead. And like Jesus, John's resurrection compelled others to continue God's work. You see, this story about John sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? But if we want to take extra biblical sources, that is, other historians outside of the Bible, what we find is that Josephus, who was a very well-known historian of the time, he says that John the Baptist, the one, beheaded today, well, he was even more popular than Jesus during his lifetime. And so perhaps today's story is revealing to us that, like John, Jesus was a preacher and a teacher, that, like John, Jesus was arrested, that, like John, Jesus was protected by a ruler until others convinced that ruler to execute Jesus for even more control, and that then, like John, Jesus was taken by his disciples and laid in a tomb, and then, like John, Jesus was resurrected and encouraged others to do what he was doing before he died. It's an odd story. It's kind of weird. And so I began thinking about today's story, specifically through the lens of our Christian faith, because that's what you all pay me to do. And it kind of brought to mind two takeaways for me. And the first, I'm going to admit, is something that came to me this morning. It reminds me, this story does, of God's vision for the world and the world's ways of engaging, how they are so very different than the world that we live in. Just yesterday in Butler, Pennsylvania, you may have seen on the news that a 20-year-old crawled on top of a building and shot bullets towards the Republican presumptive presidential nominee, Donald Trump. Now, I want to be very clear that as your pastor, I would never endorse or encourage voting for a specific political candidate in my official role as pastor. However, you all have called me to encourage you and to encourage this congregation to, quote, participate responsibly in society, end quote. That's what our congregation's governing documents say, and if you've ever been on council, you will know that well. And in the example lived out by Christ in the scriptures, it is abundantly clear that violence is not that of God. In fact, in today's reading, we see how it was power and control that led to John's beheading. It was power and control that led to Jesus' execution. Jesus did not respond with violence towards violence. John did not resort to violence either. And with that in mind, I think it is really important at this juncture that we all take a hard look at the ways our words and our actions have helped to create an environment where words like insurrection and assassination are commonplace in our society and don't even faze us this day. We need to look towards God's vision of service, of compromise, of justice, of peace, and of love. We need that more today than ever before. And I think that leads me to the second takeaway from today's reading. That is, maybe that the story's purpose is to remind us that what Jesus did was not, or what Jesus did was already continuing what God was doing in the world. That Jesus was not introducing something new, but rather that Jesus was continuing to fully live out God's vision. You see, as the Reverend Dr. Mark Davis notes, we often think the death and resurrection of Jesus is a unique story. But if this kind of story is floating around in such a way that Herod presumes that Jesus is John in resurrected form, well, then the notion that a dead person can rise from the dead and empower other persons to do what the dead person once did, well, it was not unique to Jesus. But it is also how Mark understands the manner of resurrection in general. This is how Mark understands the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that would make the resurrection of Jesus not unique in the sense of, this is something that no one had ever imagined might happen. But rather, it's something more like resurrection, which we all know means rising from the dead to empower others to do what oneself was doing before death. Well, that resurrection happened to this one, Jesus. Jesus becomes the one who fits into the existing category of resurrection, rather than resurrection being a predicate of who Jesus is. End quote. And that was all what Reverend Dr. Mark Davis said, so if it was too long and too confusing, blame him, not me. And so, besides gathering here today and perhaps blowing your mind about the idea that resurrection was actually quite commonplace in Jesus' time, and that it wasn't something that began with Jesus, all of that, though, nevertheless, is important because it is the crux of our faith. In fact, it's one of the things that I personally love most about the Easter Vigil each year. And if you haven't been to one before, I encourage it, as I do every year, for after we gather outside around the new fire and proclaim Christ's resurrection around the Paschal candle, then what we do is we get a chance to hear resurrection stories from the Hebrew Scriptures. We get to hear and be reminded that our God has been in the business of resurrection since the very beginning. You see, resurrection was when God first spoke to make order from chaos in that creation narrative. And it's also when the Israelites escaped the rule of the Egyptians through the sea. Well, that was resurrection too. And when Elijah stood in the valley of dry bones that were brought back to life, well, that was resurrection. And Noah's family in the flood, resurrection. Jonah and the whale, resurrection. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that was resurrection. And only the people who've been to the vigil are smiling in such a way that they understand what I just did there. So if you don't know what I did there and you're curious, come to the vigil. But here's the point. Resurrection was not a one-time thing. Resurrection was a thing before Jesus walked the earth, and just as we heard about in today's reading, it was also true with John. And resurrection is a thing that continues well on after Jesus. You see, I can't overemphasize this. Our God is in the business of resurrection. Our God is one that brings about new life in unexpected places. And no matter the vanity of political leaders, God's message cannot be beheaded, for it'll continue to live on in John's disciples and in Jesus' ministry. And no matter rulers like Pilate or crowds of religious leaders who will do anything to keep their power over others, God's message cannot be crucified, for it will live on in the disciples and it will live on in all of us. And the reality is, whether you like it or not, each one of us will die. And the promise of today's gospel is that we too will be resurrected. We will live on by sharing of God's will through those that we've impacted. We will live on through love and grace. We will live on by responding without violence. And that's today's gospel. And so as we think and we sit with today's gospel message, we first give thanks to God for the gift of resurrection throughout all of history and well into our future beyond what we will see. And then we're invited to imagine how we might be the resurrected Christ among us. I mean, what would it look like if we denounce political violence? What might it look like if we reminded each other across political divisions of God's love and grace poured out? What might it be like if we spoke truth like John and like Jesus, no matter the result? What might it be like to give of ourselves and of our time and of our money for our community? You see, the question today is, what might it be like to see God's resurrection among us, to see God living in us as a sign of resurrection, and then to know that our lives, we too will be resurrected, living for all eternity, sharing God's love. You see, that is what our faith is about. It is about resurrection and love. Thanks be to God for that gift. Amen.